Hi, I'm Orchi, and on this channel, I talk about books and all the insane takes I keep having about them. Today, I want to talk about Alice Munro short stories. Sadly, she passed away recently, and she had been one of my favorite writers growing up. I read her stories a lot in my teenage years, and figured this would be a good time to talk about her writing. Um, She was a short story writer at her core. Almost all of her stories are short stories, and she has a lot of collections of them. She also won the Nobel Prize in Literature, which is very rare for somebody who only writes short stories. And in that way, she's simultaneously a very celebrated writer, but also a very niche, understated writer. You would not see her pop up in like mainstream media very much. But then again, she also has her place there. And she has this very interesting writing style, which is very much her own. It's hard to fit her into a genre, which would explain why she doesn't often show up in lists of books or whatever. She writes short stories, but the stories are also always very interconnected. If there's any writer who took the advice, the writerly advice that is often dished out, that write what you know, she that's Alice Munro. She took that advice very much to heart. One could almost say that every single story she writes is about herself, but that also is a very simplistic take because she writes about very young girls, she writes about middle-aged women, she writes about older women. She writes sometimes her stories are even from the perspectives of men. And one of her signature writing styles would be her ability to make time jumps and it not being choppy. Her time jumps sig very naturally into each other. And they are always very cohesive to the story, but she also manages to give you a backstory and a current story and, and some even in between without making it choppy or flashbacky or corny. One of the things that I've always really loved about her is she's a very anti elitist writer. Her main characters don't have to be chosen ones or gifted ones or really special people. They're just normal people, and she manages to find a wealth of story in a very ordinary life. She doesn't seem, she is a, her stories are pretty much the belief that everybody can be interesting or anybody can be interesting. People on the surface level that you wouldn't think would have some, you know, scarecrow, bad brain story behind them or muddling up their lives. The most unsuspecting of people, somebody you see on a bus quietly, going about their way, might be living the craziest life below the surface. And I've always really liked that perspective. Um, and her stories are almost always about very ordinary people, people she must have known growing up. She has a very rural Canadian childhood, and her stories reflect that. There's like a few patterns that her stories definitely tend to follow, but even though there's a certain pattern, she still manages to cover a lot of different perspectives, different kinds of people, and different kinds of stories within that particular locale. So a lot of the younger women in her stories are growing up in fox farms or mink farms, or basically from farming backgrounds. And then when they're younger women and not girls, they're also just living a very humdrum life. They either have kids, or they're married, or they're just living in a small town and trying to figure out what to do. And her stories are always in the details. And this story that I've been reading very recently and kind of got me thinking about all of her stories again is called Deep Holes. Um, it was published in her 2009 collection, Too Much Happiness. which is quite the name for a story. But yeah, this story is called Depots, and it also follows into a certain pattern of story that she tends to write over and over again. It's always from the perspective of an older woman who has lost touch with one of their children. So in Depots, the entire story is from the same woman's perspective, and someone who had three kids. Her husband's a geologist, and in the beginning of the story, you kind of get one of the main events that kind of was maybe a turning point, but you don't know that at that point. It's like the oldest of her three kids, a boy, he has an accident. He falls into a hole, a ditch, and he breaks his leg, and his dad has to like get him out of it. And on the surface, it's like a simple occurrence, but this kid was like normal afterwards. There were no signs that something was wrong. And there's also other details that give away that this kid, the son, and his father did not really get along. For whatever reason, his father didn't particularly like the kid. And we'll never really know how much he could hide that fact. He seemed to prefer the two other kids. She has another younger son and a younger daughter. And this son is somehow singled out, at least with the father. But he was also particularly closer with the mother, maybe for that reason, maybe because he was sick for a while and had to stay at home. But either way, there were no signs that anything really was wrong. He obviously sensed that, his father didn't like him as much as he liked other kids. But nothing was glaringly obviously wrong until 6 months into university, he just disappears. He drops off the face of the earth as far as his parents are concerned. And just as they're getting worried and they don't know what to do and wondering if they should go to the police, they get a letter from him saying that he's all right, but not to try to like find him or contact him. And since then, he kind of just disappears from their life. Every now and then, a postcard would show up, and he would just, but it wouldn't say too much. There wouldn't be too many details about where he's living or what he's doing or how he's doing. It was pretty much just a I'm alive kind of postcard. And over time, much like everything else in life, you get used to it, no matter how weird or absurd or hard to endure it is. And, she has two other kids, and they grow up and they go on to have lives. And then, they get older and her husband dies. And in their last years, we're given to understand that she and her husband were really close. And that's so when he dies, it's a big shock to her. And, in that aftermath, when she's still coping with that, and the oldest son disappearing is pretty much, it's kind of faded into the background. It's been a long time now. He's pretty much gone from their life, and they've grown to accept it. But that's when she was just like flipping channels, watching the TV listlessly as one does. And she happened to come on this channel where they were showing that some building caught on fire on another part of the city she's living in. So she was flipping channels, but she doesn't see the channel exactly. Her daughter calls her up and is like, "Are you watching the fire?" And she goes, "Yes." And then she's like, "Switch back. I saw Kent," which was our oldest son's name. And then she goes back to the channel and she can't see, like, he doesn't show up anymore. But her daughter, who's the youngest, noticed she was also watching the fire and she saw her brother pop up on screen for a second. She was helping carry somebody out of that building. And this kind of rekindles something that was almost just, something lost to memory, an old wound perhaps. And now they're once more curious about what happened to him. And she's not too hopeful, but her daughter has a gift for burrowing into things. She can really investigate something. She has connections, and she tells her mom that she's gonna try to find out about him. And she does track him down. And he's still not too eager to meet up with them, but he does meet up with his sister at a coffee shop and agrees to meet up with their mom. He wouldn't say where he lives. He's still trying to stay away. But she's intrigued. She does want to see him. And she agrees to meet him at this train station or subway station and finds out he's become part of some sect or cult or something who don't believe in having possessions or whatever. And he doesn't really, he acts pretty much like a stranger, which I guess at that point they are. They've lived most of their lives apart. And you see it through her eyes, right? So you, as the reader, are wedged into her head. And you sense her sensing that he doesn't really like her. But he does want to ask about the father's death. He saw the obituary on the newspaper. And this is the interesting part where we knew that he always thought that his father didn't care for him much. And the question he seemed to be aching to ask was, had his father said anything about him before he died? Because in the obituary, his name had shown up as part of the family, and you get the sense that he didn't expect to see his name show up. And he wants to know if it was because his father had wanted his name to show up, and she doesn't lie. She says no, it was just a decision made by her and the other two kids. And after that, he kind of loses all interest once again. And this kind of ties into, you kind of get a sense of why he drifted away, but it doesn't fully explain it either. And this is a lot of story because this story is all of 17 pages long. And you get a whole life fitted into this little. 17 pages isn't that long. And you get a sense of a lot of things. You get a sense of her relationship with her husband, her relationship with the kid while he was growing up, her relationship with her other two kids, their relationship with their dad, his relationship with his dad, and what might or might not have caused them to disappear from their lives or not feel like he belonged. And I think that is her signature. She can fit in a whole life in very few pages. And her characters are always very fleshed out. They're not necessarily good people or bad people. They're not one-dimensional people. Her characters are very, very real. You would almost think this is somebody she knew, or they're often reminiscent of. They sound like somebody you might have known. They're very fleshed out in very few brushstrokes, which is very impressive. And when you read the stories, you're very deeply immersed into the character's head, so you pretty much feel like you're seeing the story unfold through your own eyes, which is her writing style, I would say. So you never, even though I pretty much told you the entire story, it reads much more differently. So if you read the story for yourself, you still get a much more in-depth experience than even just hearing the whole layout of the story. You see more details crop up about what might or might not have gone wrong, why he might have dropped off the face of the earth for his parents, why he wanted an entirely different life and wanted to cut connections. You can come up with 3 different theories for it for every read. And this goes pretty much for every single one of her stories, which is quite a feat. Because this is very consistent writing, and I think that's very, very hard. Very few writers do that. Because she manages to write the same normal, ordinary problems, but they're different every time, and they're consistently have depth. And this story kind of reminded me, like, she has a pattern. So just like this story, she has like 3 or 4 other stories where the gist of the story is apparent, and you see it through a mother's point of view, whose adult child has decided to disappear from their life. Sometimes more subtly, sometimes less subtly. In the case of this story, he's very clear to his mother that he doesn't want anything to do with her. But in other cases, they don't want to tell them up front. But there's always that sense of cutoff. Right off the top of my head, she has another story called Soon, one called Silence, and another one called The Moons of Jupiter, and all of them pretty much covered this story, but in a slightly different way, which makes for an entirely different story. And she's a subtle writer. She's somebody who believes in the intelligence of her reader, and she lets them figure it out for themselves. Um, in the moons of Jupiter, this is a sun. In that case, it's a daughter who kind of goes incommunicado, and she also does the time jumps where you in a little bit of it you see the childhood part, and then you see the adult part, and you see the mother's perspective when she was younger and she's older. She covers all of those characters with just as equal, with equal depth, and I think that's very very rare. And like I said, this one was 17 pages. Almost all of her stories are around the same length. So she keeps it very short. She covers all of that and all of that depth and all of those fleshed out characters in very few pages, which is why I guess it is very hard to categorize her. Um, and I could talk about more stories, but I think Alice Munro is a writer that you should read for yourself because the reading experience and the summaries never would line up. The only other writer I can think of who I think is very similar to Alice Munro is Claire Keegan, Irish writer who also only writes short stories. And she also has the same concise way of storytelling and keeps it very succinct, but also manages to convey a lot of emotions in very few words and flesh out her characters with just a few lines. And but that's a story for another day. But if you do want to read something by her, her story Foster was published in the New Yorker, so you should be able to find that online. And that's all I'm gonna say for now. I would want to talk about Alice Munro more, but I would probably save that for another video. And I think anybody looking for shorter stories to read in the summer, if you need a beach read, I think Alice Munro's stories is like a really good time to take up. Even though I wouldn't say they're light reads, a lot of it can be very bleak, but I would still say it's worth it. And yeah, thank you for listening, and I hope I see you for the next one.